It was, by any measure, a fatal error in judgment. Maxine Waters, a 30-year veteran of the political trenches, a street fighter from South LA who had built a career on audacious pronouncements and unyielding confrontation, had sized up her opponent and made a profound miscalculation. The target of her ire was Senator Ted Cruz. The setting was a House Judiciary Committee hearing, a dry, procedural affair on the Voting Rights Protection Act that was about to become anything but routine. Waters gripped the microphone like a weapon, her eyes blazing with decades of accumulated anger. Before the proceedings could even begin, she launched a full frontal assault. Not on policy, but on personality. "Senator Cruz," she declared, her voice dripping with contempt, "you sit there with your Harvard degree and your fancy words. But we all know what you are. A racist clown pretending to be smart." The room erupted. Democrats cheered. Republicans jeered. In the public gallery, dozens of law students from Georgetown, Harvard, and Yale, who had come specifically to watch their former constitutional law professor, Ted Cruz, in action, leaned forward as one. They were about to get a lesson far more valuable than anything they could learn from a textbook. Waters, in her righteous fury, had forgotten who she was talking to. She wasn't just attacking a political opponent, she was challenging a grandmaster. This clown had argued 9 separate cases before the United States Supreme Court. This pretender was a summa cum laude graduate of Princeton, a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law, and had held the title of U.S. National Debate Champion. He hadn't lost a formal debate since he was 19 years old. Waters had just challenged a linguistic assassin to a duel, armed with nothing but a pocket knife. The slaughter would be so methodical, so complete, that Waters versus Cruz would become required viewing in law schools. A permanent case study in exactly what not to do when cross-examining a hostile witness, or, in this case, provoking one. As the chaos subsided, Cruz sat perfectly still. He betrayed no anger, no offense, nothing more than a mild academic interest. While Waters had been performing for the C-SPAN cameras, Cruz had been making meticulous notes on his legal pad, the same precise way he would prepare for oral arguments before the Chief Justice. When the room finally quieted, he looked up with an expression of almost polite concern. "Madam Chair," Cruz said, his voice distinctively measured, cutting through the residual anger in the room. "Point of order." "The senator is recognized," the chair replied, eager to restore some semblance of decorum. "I thank the distinguished representative from California," Cruz began, "for her colorful characterization of my intellect and character." He paused, letting the room hang on his next words. This was the moment of maximum danger for Waters. But she couldn't see it. She expected him to fight back, to call her names, to get defensive. She was expecting a brawl. Instead, Cruz delivered a surgical strike. "Before we proceed," he continued, "I'd like to request that all statements made during this hearing, given the serious nature of the accusations being made, be considered on the record and under oath." It was a masterstroke. The law students in the gallery exchanged knowing looks. This was verbal judo. Cruz wasn't just deflecting the attack, he was using Waters' own momentum to throw her. He didn't say, "I'm not a racist." He didn't say, "You're wrong." He bypassed the accusation entirely and focused on the procedure of it. He was building a record. He was laying a legal foundation. Waters, blinded by her own aggression, saw it as weakness. She laughed harshly. "What's wrong, Harvard boy? Scared of a little truth?" "Not at all," Cruz replied mildly, his tone never wavering. "I simply believe that when we make serious allegations, particularly allegations of racism and constitutional violations, we should be prepared to support them with evidence. Under oath. Unless, of course," he added, the trap door swinging open, "the representative prefers to withdraw her statements." It was a classic debate trap. And Waters charged into it headfirst. "I don't withdraw nothing. Put it all on the record. Under oath. I'll say it again. You're a racist pretending to be an intellectual." "Excellent," Cruz said, making another crisp note on his legal pad. "I appreciate the representative's commitment to transparency." He had just secured his opponent's willing participation in her own execution. He had, in full view of the committee, handed her the shovel, and she had gleefully begun to dig her own grave. By agreeing to the under oath, stipulation. Waters had just escalated her personal insult, which would have been forgotten by the next news cycle, into a formal, legally significant accusation. She had unwittingly given Cruz license to do what he does best, cross-examine. The entire dynamic of the hearing had shifted in less than 2 minutes. This was no longer a political debate. It was a deposition. Ted Cruz was now the attorney, and Maxine Waters was the hostile witness, on the record and under oath. Now, Cruz said, his demeanor unchanged, shall we discuss the actual legislation? The slaughter was about to begin. Waters, still flush with the adrenaline of her attack, was entirely unprepared for the pivot. She had come ready for a political street fight. Cruz had just transported her to a constitutional law final exam. Don't you try to change the subject. Waters shouted, pointing at Cruz. We're going to talk about your record of suppressing black and brown votes in Texas. By all means, Cruz responded, a dangerous calm settling over him as he opened a thick, tabbed folder he brought specifically for this purpose. I am delighted to discuss voting rights law. The law students in the gallery stiffened. They recognized the tone. This was Professor Cruz, the scholar who relished intellectual combat. In fact, he continued, I've prepared a brief presentation on the constitutional history of voting rights legislation, starting with the 15th Amendment and progressing through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, its subsequent reauthorizations, and relevant Supreme Court decisions, including Northwest Austin Municipal Utility District No. 1 versus Holder and, of course, Shelby County versus Holder. Waters's expression flickered. This was not the script she had prepared for. She had expected anger, defensiveness, and counter-accusations. She had not expected a seminar. Now, Cruz continued, his voice taking on that patient, almost condescending tone of a professor addressing a struggling student. Before we discuss my record, perhaps the representative could help establish our shared understanding of the legal framework. Representative Waters, could you explain your interpretation of the Supreme Court's reasoning in Shelby County? It was a brilliant, brutal question. Shelby County versus Holder was arguably the most significant voting rights case of the 21st century. The very case that struck down the coverage formula in the Voting Rights Act and effectively ended preclearance, the entire reason for the hearing. To claim to be a champion of voting rights without being able to discuss Shelby County would be like a physicist claiming to be an expert on gravity without understanding Newton. I don't need to explain nothing to you. Waters snapped. It was a blatant, clumsy deflection, and everyone in the room knew it. I see, Cruz said, without a trace of sarcasm, which made it all the more devastating. Well, perhaps we could start with something more basic then. Could you define preclearance as it relates to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act? For the record, of course. Waters shifted in her seat. The cameras zoomed in. The law students were holding their breath. This was the Socratic method in its most lethal form. A series of seemingly simple questions designed to expose profound, foundational ignorance. Everyone knows what preclearance is, she said, waving her hand dismissively. Indeed, Cruz agreed pleasantly. So it should be easy for you to explain it. For the record. The silence stretched. Waters fumbled. Preclearance is, and it's when. She was completely lost. Finally, she grasped for the only tool she had, her grievance-based script. It's the racist system you support. I'm afraid that's not quite accurate. Representative, Cruz said, his voice laced with the gentle disappointment of a teacher correcting a child. Preclearance was actually the provision that required certain jurisdictions, those with a history of discrimination, to obtain federal approval before changing their voting laws. It was designed to protect voting rights, not suppress them. He looked around the room, making eye contact with his colleagues. The debate in Shelby County was whether the coverage formula used to determine which jurisdictions required preclearance was still constitutionally justified based on current data, or if it was an outdated infringement on states' rights. He let the explanation hang in the air, a stark contrast to Waters's incoherent rage. This is fundamental to understanding the legislation we're discussing today. If we're going to have a serious debate about voting rights, he said, looking directly at Waters, shouldn't we all understand the basic legal concepts involved? The first-year law students in the gallery were witnessing a masterclass. Cruz had, in less than 5 minutes, Established and undeniable, on the record fact, Maxine Waters, the fiery champion of voting rights, had just proven under oath that she didn't know the first thing about voting rights law. The racist clown had just exposed the intellectual as a fraud. The air in the room had changed. The Democratic side was no longer cheering, they were visibly uncomfortable. Cruz, having established intellectual dominance, now moved in for the kill, returning to Waters' original, sworn accusation. "Don't you lecture me about voting rights." Waters exploded, desperately trying to regain the offensive. "I've been fighting for voting rights since before you were born. And I respect that history." Cruz replied smoothly, disarming her appeal to seniority. "Which is why I'm so surprised you can't explain basic concepts that any first-year law student would know. But perhaps we should move on." He returned to his notes. "You accused me, under oath, of supporting Jim Crow tactics. A very serious charge. Could you please specify which of my actions or positions you believe violate the 15th Amendment's prohibition on racial discrimination in voting?" This was the show your work portion of the exam. Waters was trapped. Your whole career is about stopping black people from voting," she declared. "That's a powerful statement," Cruz acknowledged. "Surely, if my whole career is devoted to this purpose, you must have at least one concrete example. A particular bill I've supported? A specific statement I've made? A legal position I've taken? Just one, for the record." The room was silent. Waters gripped the table, her mind clearly racing, but she had nothing. Her entire worldview was built on slogans, not specifics. She had come to a gunfight armed with bumper stickers. "You know what you've done," she finally said, her voice rising in desperation. "I do know what I've done." Cruz agreed, then proceeded to define his own record before she could. "I've argued for the principle that all voting laws should be race-neutral and apply equally. I've supported measures to ensure election integrity while protecting every legal citizen's right to vote. I've opposed federal takeovers of state elections because I believe in the Constitution's allocation of powers." He paused. "If you believe any of these positions constitute racism, I'd be happy to debate their merits. But first, you need to make an actual argument, not just shout accusations. Unless, of course," he added, delivering the killing blow, "shouting accusations is all you have." He didn't stop there. He contrasted his record with hers. "In my shorter tenure, I've authored 7 bills that became law, including the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act, making lynching a federal hate crime. I'm curious, Representative, do you consider making lynching a federal hate crime to be racist?" Waters was trapped again. She couldn't call an anti-lynching bill racist. But admitting Cruz had done something positive for racial justice would undermine her entire attack. "You're twisting things. I'm asking straightforward questions about specific legislation," Cruz countered. "But let's look at legislation you supported. House Resolution 1 from 2019, which you co-sponsored. A landmark bill, you called it." He flipped to a tabbed page. Section 4203 of that bill would have prohibited states from requiring identification to vote. Can you explain how preventing states from verifying a voter's identity protects voting rights, rather than enabling fraud? Waters found her footing on familiar, if shaky, ground. "Voter ID laws are racist," she declared. "All of them?" Cruz pressed. "Even the ones that provide free IDs? Even the ones supported by a majority of black constituencies?" He then pulled out another document. "I have here polling data from your own district, conducted by Howard University's Political Science Department." He held it up, the prestigious HBCU's letterhead clearly visible. "It shows that 68% of black voters in your district support voter ID requirements. Are your own constituents racist, Representative Waters? Or are you calling Howard University liars? Which is it?" The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Waters was frozen. She couldn't attack Howard University, a pillar of black academic excellence, without alienating her base. But accepting the poll meant admitting that her signature talking point was a lie and that she was completely out of touch with the very people she claimed to represent. Having thoroughly dismantled her claims on voting rights, Cruz executed a pivot so sharp it left everyone in the room breathless. He was not just content to prove her wrong, he was intent on answering her, pretending to be smart, insult by dissecting her own intellectual credentials on the subject she was supposed to be an expert on. But let's return to qualifications. Cruz continued, closing his voting rights folder and opening a new one. You, Representative Waters, are the chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, one of the most powerful positions in Congress, overseeing our entire financial system. He looked at her, his expression one of pure academic curiosity. You accused me of being a clown pretending to be smart. So I'm testing whether you have basic, fundamental knowledge of your own committee's jurisdiction. Representative Waters, for the record, can you please explain the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy? It was Shelby County all over again, but this time, in her own backyard. The room fell into a dead, agonizing silence. This was not a trick question. This was Economics 101, a concept a first-year undergraduate could explain. Monetary policy, controlled by the Federal Reserve, deals with interest rates and the money supply. Fiscal policy, controlled by Congress, deals with taxation and government spending. As chair of the committee that oversees the Federal Reserve, this was the single most basic concept of her job. Waters glared at him, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. What does that have to do with? It has everything to do with your accusation. Cruz interjected, his voice firm. You challenged my intellect. I am now challenging yours. Monetary versus fiscal policy. It's Economics 101. Can you explain the difference? Silence. The law students were watching, horrified. This was brutal. This was like asking the Secretary of Transportation to identify a stop sign. Monetary policy is about money. Waters finally stammered, in the most circular, meaningless way possible. That is, technically true. Cruz conceded, with a slight, devastating smile. Could you be more specific? What tools does the Federal Reserve use for monetary policy? Versus what tools Congress, your committee, uses for fiscal policy? More silence. She had nothing. She was the chair of the Financial Services Committee, and she could not describe her own job. Let me help, Cruz said finally, as the entire room cringed. Monetary policy involves interest rates and the money supply, controlled by the Federal Reserve. Fiscal policy involves government spending and taxation, controlled by Congress. As chair of Financial Services, you provide oversight for the very agencies responsible for monetary policy. How? He asked, his voice dripping with genuine incredulity. Can you provide oversight if you don't understand these basic concepts? He wasn't finished. He pulled out one more document. This is a transcript from last year's Financial Services hearing, where you questioned the Federal Reserve Chair. You asked, and I quote, "Why can't the Fed just print more money to solve poverty?" He looked up. Do you still believe that's how economics works? That's out of context, she hissed. The full context makes it worse. Representative, Cruz shot back. You followed up by asking if the Fed could just give everyone $1 million. This is middle school level economic illiteracy from the person overseeing our entire financial system. He looked around the room, letting the reality of her incompetence sink in. And this is who accuses others of pretending to be smart. With Waters' intellectual and professional credibility lying in ruins, Cruz shifted his line of attack from competence to character. The under oath stipulation from the beginning now loomed over the room like a guillotine. He closed his economics folder and opened a new one. This one marked in bold letters, Ethics. Representative Waters, he began, his tone shifting from that of a professor to that of a prosecutor. Let's discuss ethics. You were investigated by the House Ethics Committee regarding a bank called One United. Are you familiar with that investigation? Waters' face hardened. I was completely cleared, she snapped. Were you? Cruz pulled out a document. I have here the final report from the House Ethics Committee. Dated September 25, 2012. Shall we read what it actually says? He didn't wait. The report states, quote, "The committee has unanimously determined that the evidence does not establish that Representative Waters violated House rules." Cruz paused, looking up. That sounds like clearance. Until you read the next sentence, however. The committee has also unanimously determined that Representative Waters' Chief of Staff, Mikhail Moore, took certain actions on behalf of One United when he knew or should have known of Representative Waters' personal financial interest. He let that sink in. Your Chief of Staff, who is also your grandson, was formally reprimanded. He acted improperly regarding a bank where your husband owned a substantial amount of stock. That's not exactly completely cleared, is it? The committee said I didn't violate. They said the evidence didn't establish a violation to the standard of clear and convincing evidence. Cruz interjected, the lawyer in him taking over. That's legal essay. Representative. We can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not a declaration of innocence. It's the same standard that let O.J. Simpson walk free. Would you say he was completely cleared? Gasps rippled through the gallery. The comparison was brutal but legally precise. Cruz continued, laying out the undisputed facts. Fact. Your husband owned $350 in One United stock. Fact. The bank was failing. Fact. You personally arranged a meeting between the bank and Treasury officials. Fact. The bank subsequently received $12 million in TARP bailout funds. Saving your husband's stock. Those are the facts, correct? It was for all minority banks. Waters protested. Was it? Cruz countered, pulling out another document, because according to the Treasury official's testimony, only One United representatives attended the meeting you arranged. Not the other 200-plus minority-owned banks. Just the one your husband was invested in. What a coincidence. But he didn't stop at One United. He turned to her broader financial history. Your most recent financial disclosure shows your net worth has increased by 300% during your time in Congress. That's impressive on a congressional salary. He displayed another chart. You've had remarkable, almost psychic, success in the stock market. You bought healthcare stocks days before the Affordable Care Act passed. You sold bank stocks days before the 2008 crisis. You bought tech stocks right before major federal contracts were announced. He shook his head in mock admiration. Statistical analysis shows your investment returns beat the market by 400%. Warren Buffett only beats it by 200%. You're twice as good as the world's greatest investor. We should call you the Oracle of South LA. Finally, he brought it home. And let's talk about family employment. Your daughter, Karen, is paid by your campaign. Your grandson, Mikhail, was your chief of staff. Over your career, roughly $1.2 million has gone from your campaign and office funds to your various family members. That's generational wealth built on public service. He looked her square in the eye. This is who lectures others about ethics. Having eviscerated her intellect and her ethics, Cruz moved to the final pillar of her public persona, her role as a righteous activist. He reached for a laptop, and the screens around the committee room flickered to life. The tone shifted again, becoming darker, more prosecutorial. He was about to use her own words as a weapon. Representative Waters, he began, you have built a career on inflammatory rhetoric. Let's examine the pattern. He clicked a button. Video from the 1992 LA riots filled the screens. A younger Waters was seen chanting, "No justice, no peace." The video then cut to her infamous quote, "If you call it a riot, it appears to be a bunch of crazy people. I maintain it was somewhat understandable. If not acceptable, I prefer to call it a rebellion." Cruz paused the video. You called the destruction of your own community understandable. 53 people died. Representative, over 2.000 were injured. $1 billion in damage. Korean immigrants watched their life's work burn to the ground. And you called it understandable. Rebellion. Is burning down an immigrant-owned business a rebellion against the man? That's taken out of context. The context makes it worse, Cruz said, clicking again. New footage, this time from 2018. Waters was at a rally. Her voice clear. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore. Anywhere. Cruz paused it. This was after Sarah Sanders was kicked out of a restaurant. You weren't calling for peaceful protest. You were calling for mob harassment. You joke about threatening American citizens. Do you think that's funny? Leadership? He clicked again. The screens now showed Waters in Minnesota. April 2021, during the Derek Chauvin trial. A city on a knife's edge. We've got to stay on the street. Her voice rang out. We've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business. Cruz let the words hang in the air. Then he pulled up a new document. This is the timeline from that night. 7:30 p.m. You speak those words. 11:47 p.m. Shots are fired at National Guard troops in that same city. 2 soldiers are injured. Your words, their blood. Still think confrontation is the answer? I didn't tell anyone to shoot. She yelled. You told an angry, volatile crowd to get more confrontational in a city that had been rioting for days. What did you think would happen? A poetry slam? Cruz was relentless. He pulled up another document. Judge Peter Cahill, the judge presiding over the Chauvin trial, said your comments were abhorrent and could be grounds for the entire trial to be overturned on appeal. You nearly destroyed justice for George Floyd with your big mouth. How is that for leadership? He displayed a compilation of news clips, Pelosi, Schumer, even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, all calling for calm, all distancing themselves from Waters' remarks. Your own party was running from you. When AOC thinks you've gone too far, you have truly gone too far. Cruz turned off the monitor and faced her directly. You've spent 30 years pouring gasoline on racial tensions and calling it leadership. You don't build, representative, you burn, and you've gotten rich doing it. This was the emotional climax. The moment the entire cross-examination had been building toward. Cruz set aside the laptop. His expression shifted from prosecutorial anger to something approaching profound disappointment. He picked up the thickest folder on his desk. One marked, CA-43 to 30 years of metrics. Representative Waters, he began, his voice softer, which somehow made it more devastating. Let's talk about the people you claim to represent. The residents of California's 43rd District. Your constituents for over 3 decades. He opened the folder and pulled out chart after chart. Median household income in your district. Adjusted for inflation. 1991. $42. Today. $38. Your constituents are poorer today than when you started. Unemployment rate. 1,991 to 7.2%. Today. 11.3%. Worse. Violent crime rate. 1,991 to 820 per 100.000. Today. 1.347. Worse. High school graduation rate. 1,991 to 68%. Today. 61%. Worse. Home ownership rate. 1,991 to 38%. Today. 29%. Worse. Each statistic landed like a physical blow. The room was tomb silent. But here, Cruz said, his voice quiet, is the most damning statistic of all. He held up a population chart. Black residents in your district. 1,991 to 51%. Today. 23%. He looked up at Waters. His eyes locking onto hers. Your black constituents didn't get rich and move to better areas. They got pushed out. Gentrification and decay. The twin legacies of your 32 years of leadership. He let the data sink in. If a corporate CEO had this record, they would be fired. But you keep getting re-elected. Why? Because average turnout in your district is 37%. Your constituents have given up. They know nothing will ever change. Then, he delivered the personal blow. And while your district decayed, while it literally burned in 1992 and 2020, where were you living? In a $6 million mansion. In Hancock Park. Outside your own district. You don't even live with your people. You live with the wealthy white liberals you claim to fight against. A champion of the poor who won't even live near them. He pulled up a video. Interviews with her constituents. An elderly black woman, Maxine Waters? She comes around at election time. Makes promises. Then disappears. Been doing it since I was young. I'm 78 now. A young Latino man. She doesn't even live here. How can she represent us from Hancock Park? Cruz paused the video. These are your constituents. Representative. The people you claim to fight for. They feel abandoned. Are they wrong? He closed the folder. You know what the saddest part is? Your constituents deserved better. They needed a champion. Instead, they got a celebrity who uses their struggles as talking points while living in a mansion. His voice rose, shaking with genuine emotion for the first time. You called me a racist. But you have presided over the destruction of one of America's historically black districts. You have let schools fail black children. You have allowed crime to terrorize black grandmothers. Who is really harming black Americans here? I've fought the system, she cried. You are the system, Cruz thundered back, 32 years in Congress. Committee chair. You are the system you've failed to change. Your district is a memorial to failed leadership. You don't represent South LA, representative. You exploit it, and after 32 years, the evidence is undeniable. Ted Cruz stood up from his seat, signaling the endgame. He walked to the center of the floor, transforming the committee room into his personal courtroom. This was the closing argument. Representative Waters, he began, his voice rhythmic. For over an hour, I have presented facts, documents, statistics, and evidence. Your response has been denial, deflection, and silence. So, let me summarize what we have established. Under oath, he paced, punctuating each point. 1. You accused me of racism without a single specific example. Your accusation was a lie. 2. You demonstrated profound ignorance of the very voting rights laws you claim to champion. Your expertise was a lie. 3. Your ethics investigation revealed you used your office to save your husband's personal investments. Your integrity was a lie. 4. You've enriched your family with over $1 million in campaign funds while your district got poorer. Your service was a lie. 5. You repeatedly incited violence. From LA to Minnesota, and then denied responsibility. Your non-violence was a lie. And 6. Your district has collapsed by every objective metric during your 32-year tenure. Your effectiveness was a lie. He stopped and faced her directly. Your entire career is built on lies. You are not a leader. You are a parasite. You feed off your district's misery, converting their pain into your profit. You don't solve problems, because solved problems don't pay. Then, he delivered the procedural checkmate. Madam Chair, he said, his voice now formal, I move for the immediate consideration of House Resolution 2847, which I am introducing at this moment. The room exploded. You can't do this, Waters shouted. It's a setup, her allies screamed. It is accountability, Cruz replied calmly, something you've avoided for 32 years. He held up the formal resolution. This resolution calls for the censure of Representative Maxine Waters for conduct unbecoming a member of Congress. Based on 3 charges. 1. Incitement to violence. 2. Using her office for personal financial gain. 3. Gross dereliction of duty to her constituents. As Republicans shouted their support, a voice came from the Democratic side. I second the motion. It was Representative Dean Phillips of Minnesota. Representative Waters' comments endangered my constituents. They deserve accountability. The room went silent. A Democrat had broken ranks. Then another, Jared Golden of Maine, stood. I second as well. The evidence presented today is troubling. We have to maintain standards. Waters looked around, panicked, but her colleagues avoided her gaze. The vote was called. All Republicans, plus a wave of moderate Democrats who had watched in horror as Waters embarrassed their party and got demolished by facts, raised their hands. The resolution passes, the chair announced, her voice barely a whisper. Representative Waters is censured by this committee. The gavel fell. In less than 2 hours, a 32-year career was destroyed. Waters sat slumped, a broken figure. Cruz gathered his materials. Madam Chair, I thank the committee for its courage. To Representative Waters, I take no pleasure in this. You brought it on yourself. He turned to leave, then paused for one final, devastating blow. Oh, and Representative Waters, he said, you asked if I was a racist clown pretending to be smart. I've demonstrated I'm neither racist nor pretending. You've demonstrated what you are. He gestured to the wreckage of her career. So let me ask you one final question. How does it feel to be exposed, censured, and destroyed by someone you dismissed as a clown? The law students burst into spontaneous applause. The video went viral before the hearing even ended. 3 days later, Maxine Waters announced an indefinite leave of absence for health reasons. She never returned to Congress. The special election in her district was won by a young community organizer who actually lived there. And the Waters versus Cruz hearing became the stuff of legend. Taught in every law school in America, a perfect 73-minute demonstration of how, in a battle of wits, preparation is everything, and facts are fatal.